One of the many aspects of Broto art climate science is that we are focused on climate hope. That we don't envision a future planet made sustainable is a missed opportunity. Imagine a future in which we can relax, a future in which the climate is not an existential threat, a future in which we're living in better partnership with nature, a future in which we are interacting rather than extracting the finite natural world. My name is Ian Edwards and I host this event. Broto is an opportunity for big thinkers to envision all kinds of ways through to a climate secure future. It's up for debate, but many believe we've moved into a new geological epoch. That's the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the time in history when humanity is affecting the planetary systems. Most think the word affecting means the overuse of resources, but what if affecting was about humanity reinvesting in nature, replenishing and rehabilitating nature? In effect, might the Anthropocene be focused on changing our extractive ways to be more interactive with nature, make it more two-way? We must think of nature as a partner. I don't think that the society in general does. Artists and scientists are the solutions towards a much needed shift toward a climate hope. Here is the expansive art science conversation about interaction, not extraction, our discussion on the reframing of the Anthropocene. Welcome, everyone, to what is our headline panel, Interaction, Not Extraction, with the very lofty goal to reframe our current geologic age, the Anthropocene. It's all part of the unique Broto brand to ask these really big questions. So here we go again. With this and other panels of the Broto Art Climate Science program called Affinity, we're looking at ways in which society is estranged or not from nature and how art science, the art science lens, might be able to help. So for discussion, if we, for example, have reached a geologic age when humanity is affecting the course of the planet, how do we make it a mutually beneficial process? Extraction of natural capital, the trees, the soil, the earth, the animals, the minerals, without a reinvestment in natural capital is a bad deal for nature. What does that mean? It means overshoot, resource depletion, biodiversity loss, climate disruptions, and I would argue a narrowing window of survivability for the humanity. Can we use the art-sci lens to reframe the Anthropocene to be about interaction and not extraction? How does an interactive society work with nature, and why should we strive for it? Joining us for this discussion is Marcia Bjornerud, a geologist, author, and a professor of an actual art-sci class, so welcome. David Maggs, pianist, sustainability scholar, and author. John Sutter, filmmaker of the ambitious climate documentary Baseline and a CNN climate analyst. And Diana Ayton-Shenker, pardon me, Diana, CEO of Leonardo, author and impact innovator. So please welcome to Marcia and David, who have been to the Broto panels before. If you want to see more about our panelists, please look at our conference portal. So thanks. I wanted to start with Marcia, since Marcia, you work in epochs in geology and deep time. Can you start us off with the basics? What is an acceptable definition for the Anthropocene, and can we rewrite that?
Well, geologists are still discussing exactly how to define the Anthropocene in a very specific scientific way, but the working definition is certainly the moment when we cross the threshold into being geologic agents on par with, say, volcanoes and rivers and other processes in shaping the surface environment of the Earth. I think another way to think about it is when we began to destabilize the relatively clement, hospitable Holocene, which is human history, that followed the Pleistocene, which was a time of great climate instability. The Holocene, the last 10,000 years, have been unusually sort of stable, and we're beginning to disrupt that stability. So to me, that's a good definition of the Anthropocene, this time of destabilization.
John, tell me what your take is on this and how it reflects maybe in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that definition, of course, and I think that depending on which branch of the sciences you're dealing with, people think about this differently. But for me, the two of the key issues of this age of human change, right, are the climate crisis, so the rise of CO2 in the atmosphere and all of the problems that's creating, and then in tandem with that, the extinction crisis. I see all of this as being related, in that humans are fundamentally destabilizing Earth systems and bringing about changes that we're seeing the beginnings of now. But I think that we don't really grasp the magnitude of the processes that we're unleashing on the planet. And so I guess in terms of my work, I think it's like telling the story of the climate crisis in particular is a big focus of mine. You mentioned I'm working on a documentary called Baseline, which is following a few communities on the front lines of the climate crisis between now and 2050 to try to trigger a different kind of thinking about the timescales that are involved here. But it's a real challenge in that the climate crisis and the Anthropocene they force us to think about timescales that we don't like to think about in our day-to-day lives. I think all of the things that give a story a sense of, like a news story, a sense of urgency and impact. It's like something that's happening right now near you that is perceived as a threat. I think that in some ways the climate crisis doesn't ring the alarm bells in our heads the same way that other issues of our time do. And so I think that that's a real challenge for storytellers and artists, not to shy away from that and avoid that, because it does pose different challenges, but to really to dive into that and to think of new ways that we can try to make sense of this period of truly rapid change when you're thinking in Earth time, but we don't always perceive it that way.
So interesting. I wanted to get your evaluation of the current relationship to nature and why it should change. David, do you have a perspective on that?
I think maybe one of the things that I've been drilling into is looking at the kinds of things that fiction tells us. And one of the things that fiction is so articulate about is how every single identity is built on a lie. No matter whether an individual lie, a collective lie, it may not turn up in the early goings of that identity, but eventually that identity turns on some kind of deeply embedded, internalized falsehood that we operationalize in all sorts of ways. And a good book takes you through the unearthing of that falsehood towards some kind of moment of recognition and transformation. That's sort of the way fiction can approach this stuff. To that question of the relationship to nature, I think that the sort of the lie in operation right now is that false dichotomy through nature that divides nature and humanity. And the way that has then operationalized is that it's turned sustainability into an imperative to save the thing over there, right. Nature. And to heal that thing that's broken, lying over there, sort of proximate to us, and in some ways relevant, and science is trying to point out how that's relevant. But we've got this sort of thing that we've got to learn about and heal. And I think in terms of our lives, we are born into this world trying to heal ourselves. And one way to think about life is as an effort to try and heal oneself and others in a day-to-day and long-term event. And so this dichotomy of there's nature and then there's humanity then creates a kind of gridlock for us existentially, because suddenly we've pitted healing ourselves with healing nature. We've pitted human well-being against the natural world, and that's just left us stuck in a way that has really prevented us from getting much past sounding the alarm and then sounding it again and then sounding it again, but never being able to proceed into that moment from an existential point of view, because we've got these two completely oppositional narratives about what it is that we're really trying to heal. So that's how I would approach that question.
Interesting. Diana, you're immersed in the art and science integration world. Do you have an appreciation for how we might be able to change our relationship to nature, or should we?
I do. I think that there are elements from what each of our colleagues here have said that feed into how I imagine art can help us bridge that shift and transition to our relationship with nature. The first piece is the role of art and the artist. And I would say, in addition to serving as the storyteller, nonfiction and film or fiction, that artists are also the catalysts, the provocateurs, the innovators who show us a new way of being. And a new way of being in relation to nature may bring us out of that polarity of us and them, or healing that externality versus healing ourselves, and rather an integration of we are part of nature. So to reclaim the Anthropocene as a time when, if human impact dominates the planet, that we're doing so in a way that is integrated with the planet, that serves and lifts up the planet as in a symbiotic relationship. So, I think that part of the role of the artist and art is to catalyze change. And one of the ways that we catalyze change through the beauty or provocative work that we can create and showcase is to instigate, to inquire, and to inspire. So, right. I think that's a very fertile and regenerative way to look at that question and this time that we're in.
Certainly most of our audience for the Broto experiment do call themselves artists. I personally believe, and I'm not an artist nor a scientist, but through this experience, I've thought that the artists themselves have been looking for a foothold in some of these strategies to try and affect change in climate. And if you look at art from streaming or music or film or television kind of perspective, the scale of this distribution for art is something that we could be using for scale and a climate remedy. So I'm really hoping that through these discussions and more, that we can get artists involved on a strategic level, maybe just the art thinking versus just not worrying about the outcome, but the process of being an artist, the investigation and the robust science that might come from that is something that might be able to help us with this. I wanted to go back to one of your earlier the definitions, and I think two of you at least used destabilizing, that the Anthropocene is about human destabilizing the planet. I just think that's bad branding. And I really would like for us to figure out what a more mutually affirming society nature partnership could mean. Does anybody have a take on that? What does that mean for some people?
Well, I'll say we don't really have any choice. We are totally embedded in nature. And whether we want to partner with it or not is, we have to. This is where we are. And I think to come back to David's point about lies, what our relationship with nature is delusional at this point. I mean, it's a complete fiction that we can somehow continue insouciantly to do what we're doing and maintain the kind of standard of living that we've become accustomed to. So I would say the role of art is to somehow reframe our relationship with nature, which not only leads currently to environmental damage, but I think deep spiritual and psychological damage to ourselves. And so as a scientist, I've found that my capacity is limited. And I think we need new ways of framing the narrative and bringing people into something like a realistic relationship with the natural world. We are not separate from nature. Nature's in charge. And if anything, the Anthropocene has ceded more control to nature because it has unleashed powerful forces that are far beyond our control. So I'm afraid that the destabilization
Yes.
of depiction is accurate, but I guess maybe that's the beginning of the recognition of the need for humility, the need for self-control. But the reality is we are going to be less and less in charge of our own destiny unless we understand the proper balance of power between ourselves and nature.
I wanted to pick up on something that David said about the falsehoods. We live in a constructed world. We agree that society is the way it is because we have some sort of consensus agreement about how it should or shouldn't operate. Somewhere along the line, after industrialization, certainly in comparison to Aboriginal cultures, we became disenfranchised with nature. And I would like to see us return to some of those humility and simplicity. But I don't know if our culture, as it's constructed now and how we agree to live in it, is pointed in that direction. John, in your film, you're going through several different communities to explore some of these ideas. Do we have the culture that will allow us to have a more nature-friendly partnership?
So I think some communities are doing a better job than others at sort of realizing what's happening around them. I like Marcia's point about that we're delusional and disconnected. I mean, I also think that the way that we tell stories and the way that our like collective memories work they're not sufficient for this moment of, to us, slow moving, but in reality, very rapid wholesale change in the natural world. So, I mean, this film is called Baseline. It's named that because of this idea of shifting baseline syndrome, which comes from fisheries science and this guy, Daniel Pauly. It's basically this idea that environmental change happens slowly enough that we fail to perceive the full magnitude of what's at stake. It's also sometimes called generational amnesia, which I like as a way to frame it, because I do think in some ways it's about memory. And so each of the communities that I'm focusing on, they have some interesting tradition or some way of trying to connect to the memory of their place in some way, like stories cross generational lines. So one of the communities is in Alaska. It's in a Inupiat village where names kind of perform that function. So when someone is born in the village, they're typically named after the most recent person to have passed away. Whether they're related or not, right? It's just a way of sort of continuing the story of the place. And it's not like literally seen as reincarnation by all people, but to some degree, people accept that like that person who died, their story is now living in the young person who's in the village. And those traits are alive and the story of that time is alive. And so there's this kind of like recognition of how time is passing and the ways in which that community relates to its landscape. So that's one example. There are others in other locations, but I think sometimes when a community like that place is very tied to the cycle of the seasons, right? Because of like subsistence hunting and sort of farming practices, people are sort of more directly engaged with natural cycles and are able therefore to notice very drastically in the Arctic, like how much things are changing. I think in other places we become pretty dislocated from what's happening around us. And I think that the point that Marcia made about this is happening whether we notice it or not. And to me, I'm hoping to sort of wake up that muscle that might help people notice some of these big but slow moving changes that are happening all around us. And I do think that that's an important role that art can play, kind of like to shake people by the shoulders a little bit and say like, here's a different way to look at the reality of what's happening around you. And I get asked sometimes if this is like, I don't know, if I see these stories as tragic. Like I've been asked that question a few times, and I don't like to see it that way. My hope is that by observing the sort of the first step of reckoning is like a very clear-eyed observation of what's going on around us, and we have to move past that. Like we should have moved past that long ago, but I still don't think that we fully grasped the magnitude of what's happening all around us. And so I think that that's an important part of a bigger conversation that also needs to be about technology and solutions and all sorts of other things.
David, do you see a way through this in your work?
I was just interested in John's remarks there. I grew up in a part of Canada on the far east called the island of Newfoundland, which went through a huge collapse in the 1990s, as it was basically a single industry place where the codfish collapsed and they shut down the fishery entirely. It was a major event, one of the biggest sort of socio-ecological economic collapses in recent years. And one of the things that has always struck me about that event is that from that collapse, within that cultural paradigm, there wasn't a scrap of an environmental ethic that emerged from that event. So I have a very low faith that kind of disaster and collapse and waking up is our path towards moving on this issue. I think in many ways that can produce kind of the opposite response that we want. Gathering, hoarding, getting me and mine safe, and then, to hell with the rest of the world, that can come from that kind of spirit. And so what I've always tried to do with, I certainly can't wave any triumphant flags on this, but what I've tried to do was to shift this in existential terms as best I can. And so from the point of view of what the Anthropocene is, trying to see that as a shift from the kinds of questions that underpinned us when we were living in that modernist West, built on the Holocene realities, where the world was this knowable natural object driven by natural laws. And the basic question that we could ask at that time was, what is true? And now that we move into this place of chaotic and complex problems, and the inability to establish the kind of scientific certainty over the world and create this tidy relationship between what we know and what we should care about, we move into this very perplexing question of how do we live faithfully in a world that is suddenly of our own making? And that, as an existential condition, I think is relatively unprecedented. We haven't had to navigate those waters before. There aren't a lot of examples that we can look to say, well, what does that look like? And I think that shift from being able to sort of figure out what is true and the faith in figuring out what is true and then knowing what to care about is the way that the sustainability paradigm has been played out, right? It's get the facts straight and then tell people what to do. And we've spent a lot of time watching that really produce no dramatic effects at all in terms of benefit. And so, the kind of shock that we can watch Donald Trump spend 4 years not saying anything true and nobody minds, right? Or at least 75 million people don't mind, has sort of created this kind of, that's the fissure that we're trying to cross right now. That move from trying to ground the world in these objective absolute facts to the one of saying, okay, this is the world we're creating. We have to come together and figure out how we create that collective common world in a way that's functional. And so it raises not just sort of scientific questions about how do we describe this problem, it raises all kinds of ethical questions, equity questions, questions of distribution. Sustainability primarily becomes an exercise in justice at that point.
Absolutely agree. Diana, you gave me a word that I've used often in the recent times, a syndemic. That, pick a pandemic. We've got more than we can handle at the moment, probably because we don't have a very strong relationship with nature or understanding of where we might fit in nature. How do you explain that?
Well, I was recalling this word in the context of this conversation, that some of the issues coming up that I think are central to the shifts we want to make happen are understanding our sense of time and our sense of truth. So we've looked at how we might have time disrupt our ability to take action because we don't really understand time. We can't absorb time on the scale that we're looking at. On the one hand, the other hand, the current pandemic of COVID that has been exacerbated by other cascading crises, creating this synchronized pandemic cluster, or a syndemic of not only the public health crisis, but the social justice crisis, the economic disparity crisis, the political volatility crisis, the social disintegration crisis, and climate change, which I would say is not the elephant in the room, it's the room, that crisis of this syndemic really distorts and shifts our sense of time. But this current crisis of COVID that's upended the way we live our lives and have since March of this year has really warped our sense of time. We're, like, what day is it today? We can't figure it out. Things seems like, is it already the end of November? What? Isn't it still March? What happened to the summer? Like, the seasons have just, been somehow molded together. And then, like, on a daily basis, it's like, what time is it? Yeah, things are so slow. It takes forever. So, there's this very altered state that we've come to understand with time. But it's also allowed us to accelerate changes we otherwise would probably have needed decades to put in place. So as I've been thinking over the years about the kinds of social changes that we want to see that not only respond to climate change, but or sustainability as a call to justice, rather the imperative regeneration, not to sustain business as usual, but regenerate, reclaim who we're going to be as a species integrated with nature. But it would take too long. We've only got 10 years. How are we going to get it accelerated? Well, we just accelerated things. And underlying that shift in our sense of time during this syndemic is a shift in our understanding of truth during this syndemic. And you're right, David, the political climate also warps that, because to recognize truth, we need trust. And we need to be trustworthy. We need to be worthy of that trust. And we've had a lot of gaps from the systems of upholding our society and the leaders who were in positions influencing that society. So now it's on us. It's on all of us to build that trust. And our tools of art and humanity are worthy of that trust in a way that I think shows us the value of truth as a value. The artifice and fiction of art doesn't just convey fundamentally a falsehood. Sometimes it shows us the truth. Sometimes we need that to see the truth in a new way. So I think that in this time of syndemic, our shifting sense of truth and time that's enhanced by art, by the best of our creative spirit and our human spirit, that sense of humility and wonder and compassion will be critical to how we evolve.
David, I hear your and maybe ambivalence about how we are not working toward a sustainable future. One of our exercises through the Broto program is to sort of imagine a world made sustainable, and what happens? What have we done to make that happen as a reality? Reverse engineering it. If we were to have a nature-specific or a nature-centric culture or a society, how would nature respond? Can we extrapolate from science or theory that how would nature respond to something like this where we actually pay attention?
One of the things I think I go back to is that, well, we are the response. We are nature responding, and the more that we can try and close that deep axiomatic gap buried in the backs of our minds, the better. So I think part of the issue is that we are responding, and a lot of people are responding. And I think that there's a wonderful guy, Ulrich Beck, who writes a lot about the risk society. He's got a wonderful book called The Metamorphosis of the World that he wrote most of and then died, and it came out sort of posthumously. And when one of the things that he says that I take a lot of heart in is when you know that the whole world is really, really bellowing about not getting anywhere on an issue, you're getting somewhere on that issue. And so I take some heart in the wisdom of that remark, that the louder this signal is, the more optimism we can take, because we're identifying this as a problem over and over and over again. And I think the way these things go is that it's just sort of this looming impossibility for a long time, and then you get to the other side of it and you go, sorry, what was the problem?
What was the problem? Yeah.
So I'd love to, that's my optimistic answer. I think I'm going to just stop with my optimistic answer.
Marcia, you're the scientist. I mean, nature would come back at what scale and in what time frame?
Nature is resilient. And I mean, as a counterpoint to the Newfoundland tragedy, there's the Norwegian case where the cod fishery there was also on the brink of collapse. And people did get together and look at the science and the social science, and people agreed to cease fishing for 10 years, and the fishery rebounded. So there are cases where we've learned to restrain ourselves. I mean, that's the great challenge. And then there are many examples from geologic events. I think of Mount St. Helens, which now feels like ancient history, 1980. When it first happened, it was sort of an analog to nuclear holocaust or something. And now it's really an exemplar of the resiliency of nature, how quickly the ecosystems rebounded. It's become this amazing laboratory to see how quickly nature recovers from what seems to be an apocalypse. And we have unintentional experiments like this that we've created, like the DMZ between the Koreas. It's this verdant, amazingly biodiverse area. No humans dare tread there. But it's become this just astonishingly vibrant natural community, and even Chernobyl has recovered. So I think there is reason to hope that with just a little bit of restraint on the part of humans and the cultural change that we need to stop primarily identifying as consumers and think of ourselves as citizens in every sense of the word, civic citizens, but also earthlings,
Yes.
earth citizens, there is reason to think that nature will rebound. But we do need not to push ourselves to that Newfoundland moment where we've exceeded the capacity of even the very resilient mechanisms of nature.
John?
Yeah, I mean, I do find a lot of hope in those examples. I do think that pressure for change builds and builds and builds and then crosses a certain threshold. I do think that there's a lot of, if you look at like polling in the US, not that the US is the world, but like, you know, the percentage of the country that is acknowledging the reality of climate science and saying that they want swift action in a bunch of different ways. You know, it's a lot of people. It's a majority in most cases. And when it comes to like supporting a lot of clean energy policy, it's a vast majority. So I think it's become unnecessarily politicized. I don't know exactly how to go about undoing that, but I do share the optimism of this group that you know, that we can learn from our mistakes. I think that, to me, I tend to respond to, and I think a lot of, especially like younger like climate activists who I talk to, respond to the justice argument that I think David brought up earlier. I think that this is a moral issue, and I think when framed that way, it does sort of trigger a wider cross section of people to think about it and to care about it in a deep way. I mean, I think the fact that a lot of the people who are struggling the most in the climate changed era, like, are you know, have fewer economic resources to deal with the consequences. Like, I've spent a lot of time for CNN in various climate disaster zones, and you know, it's usually people who are struggling, who are faced with these huge costs that rarely is anyone helping them bear. So I do think that we have the aptitude to change, and I do think that there's like this kind of growing political will. And I think that sort of North Star ideas and North Star thinking are important in terms of reframing the conversation. That's one reason I've been the Paris Agreement, for all its flaws and lack of teeth. I think setting clear goals is important. I like E.O. Wilson's half Earth argument for the same, in the same like sort of category. I think we have to state clearly, like, not just here are the problems, but here's where we need to be headed together, and have some sort of metrics to benchmark ourselves against. And I do think, again, for all of its flaws, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and half Earth are really important metrics that are becoming more commonly known. And I think that as people process those things, like, they're able to see really how long we've been putting off these decisions, right? Because if you look at the history, you know, like, we've known the realities of climate science for a few decades now. And, you know, there have been fossil fuel companies actively trying to hide that. But then there's also just been this apathy that's grown around it at various points in time. And I think people are starting to recognize like that length of the human history of our like sort of small attempts to deal with these things, and really like these North Star visions of like, here's what it would take if we were to kind of reconcile and readjust and reassess our relationship with nature. What would that look like? Like, I respond to that kind of thinking. I think that the climate activist movement is really pushing in those directions, in part because it gives at least some vision of a different reality, as opposed to just, you know, a list of apocalyptic outcomes.
Sure. You know, I wanted to push back a little bit on this idea that it's a moral argument. I think at this point, it's just us getting out of the way and making a choice to support it. There's lots of evidence that you know, peer pressure or shaming or kinds of guilting us into a better behavior hasn't really worked. But I trust that the younger generations have a better handle on it, and let's hope for it. So,
actually, I would respond. I don't want to. I don't want to give up our own responsibility by our trust in the younger generation, even though I have it.
Yep.
I feel like there's. I hear a lot from peers and older people saying, "Well, we couldn't figure it out, but the next generation will." And I think it's on all of us. So I think we're, you know, here now, and the issue of equity is one that really does need to be it needs to be exposed and honored and addressed. At the same time, I don't think that the guilt and shame is the most constructive part of either reconciliation around equity or reconstruction to regenerate how we go forward in nature. That's really going to come, as John was mentioning, from these flawed but actual metrics that we have to reference. So we have the Half Earth, we have Paris Agreement, we have the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and who knows what else we will call on from previous traditions or emerging metrics. But it's ultimately not just the goal to be healed. You know, we say healing as a gerund. It's an active state. So I think it's a constant practice. If you look at nature, nature doesn't get healed and then it's done. It's not static. Neither are we. We know that even in our own lives. If you get, you know, you heal from something, it's part of your story then. And you're constantly healing by living with it. So the real question is, what will it mean to be healthy as an integrated species in the planet? And part of being healthy is going to be constantly healing and interacting and seeing what that looks like and recalibrating those metrics we can reference that hold us and get us there. And yes, trusting the next generation, and at the same time, trusting our elders and trusting each other and trusting ourselves.
Could I follow up with what Diana's saying? I've been trying to articulate an idea that I think might be a helpful reframing, which is that we are still stuck in a kind of Victorian mindset about what progress is. Basically, it's the idea, it's an imperialist idea that we can just keep exploiting nature and that progress is about outwitting nature. Just tricking, finding out how it works, and then kind of doing an end run around. And I think what we could start to say is that we have to leave behind this Victorian attitude of the early industrial revolution and mature into a kind of adulthood as a species. And we're still very much stuck in a 19th century paradigm, I think. And maybe, I don't know, maybe that doesn't help us, but to me, kind of revealing the high-tech wizards who think that the next great technology is going to save us, that's kind of way of putting them back in their place. You're thinking like a Victorian.
Right.
How would you characterize the news about the vaccine for the COVID? Yeah.
I'm hopeful, I guess. I mean, I'm not a Luddite, and I embrace technology for humanitarian purposes, but I'm a great skeptic of people like Elon Musk and others who think we can engineer another planet to be hospitable or, fix the climate by doing climate engineering instead of actually learning to control ourselves.
But the vaccine, I mean, that's a classic example of figuring out and tricking, right? So,
True. I know. So maybe sometimes it's okay to trick nature, but I think that in the end, we can't trick the whole planet. I'm a geologist, so I'll feel more comfortable talking about geologic.
But you could look at medicine, David, also as not just a way of tricking nature, but a way of dancing with nature. So it's less about conquest, control, and more about taking, especially with a vaccine, you're taking an element of this threat and making it part of you to work with it differently. And before this vaccine, in traditional ecological knowledge, gave us berries we would be able to consume that didn't trick nature, but found a way to work with it. And we could think of our technologies as well, our built environment, our constructed work, as a kind of natural ecosystem as well. I think the real shift is in how we relate to that, how we relate to each other, how we relate to ourselves.
So on that note, I'm going to say to our audience, please get your questions ready to ask in the chat box. I want to say thank you to our panelists, and we're going to pop up in a second to do some live Q&A. I always say that people got us in this problem, people will get us out of this problem. So I'm really hoping that that's something that can be true. And to Marcia's point, we spend a lot of creative fictional ideas about how to create the perfect planet or how we might engineer a life on another planet when we should be thinking maybe about how to engineering life on this planet. So anyway, I hope we got to some of the questions on the Anthropocene. Ask us some more, and I will say ciao for now and see you in a couple of seconds. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the live portion of our panel on the Anthropocene. I wanted to say thank you to our panelists, and just to alert our audience that John Sutter is not able to join us for this particular part of the show. I just wanted to ask our panelists if they've had any thoughts after watching that, whether we've actually started down the road of interaction versus extraction. David, did you have any thoughts about this as it came through?
I was really struck by just sort of that conversation moving towards a sense of compromise, mushy, sort of compromising solutions that lie somewhere in the middle of the various ways that we can think about this. I think it's easy to move towards kind of real fundamentals and absolutes, and then when you sort of put them all together, you think, okay, somewhere in the middle of all this, It's about muddling through, was the spirit that I took hearing that conversation.
Well, I could add to that. It's very interesting to go back and hear a conversation that you had a couple of weeks ago, because sometimes we do this in our head, right? Oh, I should have said this, or oh, I forgot about that, and now we get to hear it. And one thing I'm so struck by is how smart everyone is, and how inspired I am by our colleagues, and this very rich framing and notion of interaction versus extraction. So I actually think that's what strikes me the most, is how the theme of interaction is a kind of living theme in the way that we're interacting with our own thoughts, with each other, with ourselves, with a community that we're building, and the way that we're moving towards and exploring how we interact with our future as it's unfolding, this future notion of a hopeful climate, of regeneration, of integration of the species with nature, of a reclaiming of the Anthropocene. So the thing that strikes me the most is how interactive this process is, that we're in the middle of activating, both from the sense of healing and the sense of creating.
Of course, I had lots of esprit d'escalier moments after our conversation too. And a couple of thoughts. One is, we talk a lot about when did the Anthropocene begin, and we're still arguing that. But more interesting is, when will it end? And there are really two ways it could end. One is that humans go extinct. That's not such a great option. The other is when we envision this future of blending in and no longer making the footprints that will be so obvious in the future geologic record. I mean, a lot of the arguments, the kind of arcane academic arguments about when the Anthropocene began, hinge on how would we detect this in the rock record. Right. And so our goal should be invisibility, that there should be no trace that we were ever here. And another thought I had was that what we're really talking about is reimagining the commons, some collective shared space that we all care for and about and all belong to. And I think that's where the art and the science meet, that the artists can help reconceive the commons in some way, in a space that is free, we hope, from political polarization, and can lead us into this imagined shared future community. So I think this idea of the commons is something that I found maybe as an integrative thought following our conversation.
One of our audience members, Anton, asks, does our capitalism not erase all our options to balance with nature? It's a loaded question. Anybody have an answer?
There's a whole movement to try and rename the Anthropocene the Capitalocene. So it's, it's certainly something that a lot of people are turning on to say this is really what's driving this.
But we can use the powerful levers of capitalism for good too. I mean, it's the market is a potent force, and if we're smart, we can harness that and not let it just be this juggernaut that runs over everything. Diana, sorry.
We did have a panel last Saturday, Anton, on finance, which looked at creatively reimagining what finance might do through an art science lens. So maybe that's a place for you to start. And then we have another panel in about an hour that will be looking at business and government as partners in this move towards more affinity with nature. I just wanted to get some other questions here so Urania, a friend of Broto, has asked, people have a limited capacity for worrying about issues. what are some of the tools and strategies that can be explored to acknowledge and move this through this finite pool of worry and encourage people to act? I mean, fear is a big issue in all of this. Do you guys have another perspective?
Well, I think aligning, we can't take on more worry, but recognizing, as I think Diana said in the recorded conversation, that all of these things are linked in some way, brings them together. If we can align human justice and environmental stewardship under the same tent, then and have a sense that all of these things are linked and we're making progress on all fronts. That's one approach.
I would agree with that, Marcia. It's turning towards the way in which these become our life projects, and these are not movements towards reducing harm or reducing worry, but these are movements towards producing joy. Is the orientation that will get us somewhere on this.
So, that notion of creating joy, producing joy, and to what Marcia touched on, the integration, the intersection of this syndemic, and in doing so respond to Sagar Sumaria's comment in the chat, which is to say that we start where we are, and where we are right now is on this panel in a position of unquestionable privilege. Otherwise, we wouldn't be on this panel. So, I mean, it's a privilege to get to share our thoughts, a privilege to get to explore these thoughts with each other. And whatever the perceived tone of my and hue of my skin color or my racial privilege is, that doesn't abdicate me of my responsibility to engage. I really appreciate Sagar bringing up the question of race, not only theoretically, but actually with this group, and Chelsea's question about bridging the relationship with more than human communities and integrating an Indigenous standpoint. I think that these movements and moments that we're a part of in reckoning how this is intersectional and how we engage with this is important, because we're in the process of that reckoning. So I want to acknowledge that.
Peter Turin, who's a board member on Broto, and we're thankful for his service in helping us do this, says Thomas Homer Dixon has written a book about the role of hope in addressing the environmental crisis. What's the panel's opinion on the role of hope to get us towards interaction?
Absolutely essential. And again, this is where art can help. We are having trouble envisioning a hopeful future at this point. And hey, artists, writers, musicians, build that bridge for us and let's get on it. And I am hopeful for the reasons that I articulated in the panel. Nature is powerful. And I think although we're altering it in profound and dangerous ways, it doesn't mean nature's weak. So, that's cause for hope, but it's also cause for humility, as I said before. David?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely echo the sentiment. The end of hope is done. I mean, you can stop fussing. I mean, the other piece of that is to say, okay, well, if we're going to orient ourselves to hope, how does it not sort of become a kind of Pollyanna aspect? And I think that's there's a technical literature out there on shifting the problem away from a harm reduction strategy. And most sustainability is predicated on reducing harms, on becoming less awful. And when you tell humans, can you try and become a less awful version of yourself? They don't leap at that opportunity. So I'd send people to the work of John Robinson out of the University of Toronto, who's done a lot of great stuff on regenerative sustainability. And the big issue there is moving from harm reduction, trying to get out of harm reduction, which I find incredibly compelling. And it's sort of it's the methodological aspect of taking on hope as a fundamental condition. Often we take on hope as a fundamental condition, then we go back to a very sort of don't get your hopes up approach to sustainability, which is, doesn't mobilize in the way that we need to.
Another thought I had quickly, and in reviewing our conversation, was Aldo Leopold. I think what people want to do is the right thing, but one of the great challenges is when what seems to be right from a human perspective is not right for the environment. And again, if we can align the ethic, he had the land ethic. It was that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. And if in the biotic community we include humans, that's the ethic that can inform our future. And people want to do the right thing. It's just not clear what the right thing is sometimes.
I want to say thank you to our panelists. Diana, I'm sorry for any tech issues, but we will return to this issue again and again. I think this is an ongoing Broto conversation, and I hope that we are able to convene something like this in the future. For our attendees, we have another session coming up in an hour. And then at 3 o'clock Eastern time, so it's 3 hours from now, we will be convening our culture talk, which also gets into some of this material. It's a very interesting, expansive talk about where we are as a culture and society. So I think it also overlaps a little bit with what we're talking about today. So again, thank you to everybody. Sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but we will try and do this again some other time, and certainly reach out to us and the speakers if you have questions that go beyond this. And I want to say thank you and goodbye.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.